Hello Dom, I hope you and your subscribers are having a great day, whether it's morning, afternoon or evening. Today I want to share with you a truly terrifying and disturbing experience I had at a hospital in the United States. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Leandro. I was born in the US and have lived here for practically my entire life. But my parents and most of my family are Mexican, so I also consider myself Mexican. I graduated in nursing in 2010, and from there, the real work began. The first 5 years were very stressful, but like everything in life, you get used to it over time. However, there are things that never become routine, the strange and unexplained events that occur in hospitals. In 2017, I was transferred to a new hospital because they were in need of staff. It was an old, government-run hospital. Until that point in my career, I had only worked in private hospitals. Even so, I was more than prepared, so I accepted the transfer without any objections. The salary would be just as good, although the workload might be more intense. When I arrived, a colleague showed me around, explained the schedule, and gave me basic instructions. He mentioned that the top floor, the 6th, had been deactivated for some time, abandoned, and without lighting. What caught my attention was the warning to be very careful with the elevator, as some staff members had accidentally pressed number 6 and ended up on that floor. I thanked him for the instructions and was ready to begin. Despite having to work the night shift 3 times a week, which wasn't ideal, I accepted the challenge with enthusiasm. The first few days went by normally. It was more intense than my previous jobs, but still within the expected range. However, one night something happened that I would never have wanted to experience. I arrived at the hospital around 10 p.m. for another night shift. The atmosphere was calm, almost empty. Only the receptionist and the cleaning man were present. I greeted them both and walked down the hallway toward the elevators to go to the 5th floor, where I worked. In the distance, I saw an older woman in a hospital gown entering the elevator. I found it strange because it wasn't common for patients to wander around alone. I hurried to catch up, but the doors closed before I could. I waited outside, expecting the elevator to return. But when I looked at the panel, I noticed that the woman had stopped on the 6th floor, and then the elevator started descending. I assumed she would still be inside when it opened again, and that way I could help her get to the right floor and figure out what she was doing there. However, when the doors opened, there was no one inside. At that moment, I realized she had gotten stuck on the 6th floor, which was deactivated and without lights. My first assumption was that she was a confused patient due to medication, so I decided to go up and try to help her. When the elevator reached the 6th floor and the doors opened, I was surprised to see that the floor was fully functional. I was perplexed. There wasn't a single person, but all the lights were on, and the place was as clean and organized as the other floors. Although no one was visible, I could hear voices coming from the surrounding rooms while I was still inside the elevator. Don't ask me why, but I decided not to step out, fearing the cameras might record me. For a moment, I thought it might be a restricted area for secret activities. It might sound like something from a movie, but I was scared that the people in charge would know that I had seen something and that somehow it could put me at risk. So I quickly went down to the 5th floor, but I couldn't hide the mix of nervousness and confusion. A colleague named Yasmin, who worked on the same floor as me and with whom I had already developed a good friendship, immediately saw me and asked what had happened. I wasn't sure if I should trust her and tell her what I had seen, but I ended up opening up. I needed to know if she had any information. What I didn't expect was her reaction. Yasmin was visibly scared and kept repeating, "That's not possible." She then told me that once the elevator had taken her to the 6th floor without her knowing why. However, when the doors opened, there was only debris and the floor was completely dark. We both stood there processing everything until she suggested, "We need to go back there." We set a time for 4 a.m. when everything would be calmest. Although I was scared, I couldn't let the doubt continue to gnaw at me. I had to go back. When the time came, we first made sure no one was nearby in the hallway who could see us, as the elevator's floor number is visible from outside, and we didn't want to draw attention. We didn't know who we could trust. When we finally went up, it was surreal. The floor was exactly as Yasmin had described, deserted, full of debris and completely dark. The only light came from the elevator. I cursed out of pure shock, trying to convince Yasmin that I had really seen something strange earlier. She said she believed me, seeing my expression of surprise and fear. Then she confessed that she also believed it because she had heard footsteps coming from that floor before, but never questioned it, thinking it could just be animals. Now, however, she was beginning to doubt that, but the worst was yet to come. When we tried to go down, the elevator wouldn't close its doors, and there we were, exposed to that terrifying scene, with no one knowing where we were. The atmosphere became heavy, suffocating. Yasmin started feeling bone pain, something she said she had never experienced before. My legs began tingling so much that I had to sit down. It was bizarre and utterly unsettling. We knew that place carried negative energy. Anyone who has gone through something like that will understand. While all this was happening, Yasmin tried to call the reception using the intercom, but no one responded. Then finally a female voice appeared. We both felt relieved, thinking the receptionist had finally answered us. Yasmin explained the situation and asked for help to get us out of there. However, the response came with a sarcastic laugh, completely out of context, and the voice simply said, "You'll be fine." After that, total silence. No matter how much we tried, no one responded again. I didn't have my phone, as it was charging downstairs, and Yasmin's had no signal, but we could see it was already 5 a.m. We had been there for nearly an hour, feeling body pains, enduring that oppressive atmosphere and dealing with that horrid sight. And then, the peak of terror happened. Noises started echoing from the far end of the hallway. We couldn't see anything, but it sounded like someone was moving among the debris. We fell silent, filled with fear. Suddenly, Yasmin grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. I wish she hadn't done that because what we saw was terrifying. A woman in a hospital gown crawling on the floor coming toward us. Yasmin dropped the phone and we both started screaming. I stood up, fueled by adrenaline, and began pressing all the buttons on the elevator until, finally, it worked. The doors closed and we went straight down to the reception. We got out of there almost in tears. I was trembling and Yasmin was clearly in shock. Shortly after, she angrily went to the reception to complain to the receptionist for not helping us and for laughing at us. However, the receptionist seemed genuinely confused, insisting she hadn't received any calls from the elevator and hadn't spoken to anyone. This left us completely bewildered. Her tone was serious, and you could tell she was telling the truth. Moreover, the voice we had heard in the elevator was much higher pitched than the receptionist's, which was more low-pitched. Even so, Yasmin kept insisting, explaining that we had been trapped in the elevator for nearly an hour, between 4 and 5 a.m. But to our surprise, the receptionist looked at the clock and showed us it wasn't even 4 a.m. yet. Yasmin checked her phone, and indeed, the time was the same as when we had gone up to the 6th floor. We never managed to understand why this happened. We don't know if it was a glitch on Yasmin's phone, or if somehow we entered some sort of time limbo, and maybe we never will. What's certain is that we never went back to that floor again, not out of curiosity or for any other reason. We completely avoided it, and we didn't tell anyone what happened, not even our colleagues. That was a pact we made. Today I no longer work there, but even so I tried investigating online to see what could be going on that floor and why it was deactivated. Unfortunately, I found nothing. It seems like that information has been very well hidden, or someone influential doesn't want people to know what really happened there. So, I don't have answers for you, who are likely just as curious as I am about what that place hid and why it was full of such heavy energies and evil presences. Hospitals hold many secrets far beyond what we imagine. The very energy of these places is already dense due to everything that happens there, but imagine when atrocities occur there, the vibrations become unbearable. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. Let's move on to the next story. My name is Kaik, and I've been a nurse for 9 years, working in several hospitals throughout my career. I no longer live in the city where I started, as I was transferred to another place, but in every hospital I've had unique experiences. Today I'm going to share what happened during my first year of work, when I was still a novice. I landed a job at the general hospital in my city. I was super excited and happy. as it wasn't easy to get hired there, but I made it. In the first few weeks, everything went relatively smoothly until I started experiencing something rather strange. One time, we were in the middle of a complicated surgery. I was one of the assisting nurses. We were all focused on the task, with me assisting the doctor alongside 2 other colleagues. At one point, the doctor asked me to fetch a tool from a table just a few steps away from where the surgery was taking place. I turned to get what he had asked for, found the item and grabbed it. But when I turned back to hand it to the doctor, I saw a man standing in the corner of the room, near the door. He was dressed like a doctor, wearing a lab coat and a stethoscope around his neck, but I didn't recognize him. He wasn't one of the hospital's doctors, at least I had never seen him, and he hadn't introduced himself. At that moment, the doctor shouted for the tool. I handed it over and apologized for the delay. When I looked back at the corner, the man was gone. In that area, it's practically impossible for someone to enter, especially during a high-risk surgery, and the most disturbing part was how he disappeared in a matter of seconds. The surgery was successfully completed, thankfully. That night, I asked one of my colleagues, who had also been in the room, if she had seen the doctor standing in the corner during the procedure. She seemed confused and told me no, that the only doctor present was the one performing the surgery. She even asked if it could have been one of the other hospital doctors, but I assured her it wasn't. I'd never seen him before. I found the whole thing very strange. My colleague then said I must have imagined it because there were no other doctors around besides the ones we already knew. I tried to brush it off, and though I knew it had been real, I tried convincing myself that it was my imagination, perhaps due to the pressure of such a risky surgery. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The following night, I was on the night shift, which I initially enjoyed because the hospital was much quieter with no visitors and the hallways empty. However, that night was completely different. A patient, a 45-year-old woman with kidney issues, had been admitted for some time. We had developed a bond as we spoke daily, and she often shared stories about her life with me. That night, I went to her room to check on her and give her medication before she went to sleep. When I entered, she smiled at me but seemed a bit scared. I noticed an unusual expression on her face and asked if everything was okay. She was usually very cheerful, even with her condition, but that night something was different. Then she said, "A doctor I don't know came in a while ago." She thought he was someone new there to examine her, but he just stood at the door, watching, without saying a word, despite her attempts to find out who he was. After some time, he simply left, leaving the door open. That intrigued me. I asked her to describe the man. As she began to describe him, I quickly realized it was the same man I had seen during the surgery. "Stay calm. It was probably just one of the doctors making a last round before leaving." I tried to reassure her. However, she still seemed unsettled, saying that his gaze made her feel uneasy, as if she had a bad feeling. I gave her the medication, stayed with her until she fell asleep, and then left to check on the other patients. The night felt endless. I continued checking on the patients to make sure they were all fine. Almost everyone was asleep. I decided to go downstairs for some coffee and met 2 colleagues. One of them already knew about the man I had seen during the surgery. As soon as I walked in, I noticed they were talking with confused expressions. Then, one of them said she had also seen him in the surgery. I asked what they were talking about, and the other nurse explained that just a few minutes earlier, during her rounds, she had seen a man standing at the end of the hallway, dressed as a doctor, but she didn't recognize him. She tried calling out to him, but he entered a dead-end hallway where there was only a window that faced the street. A little nervous, she walked over, knowing he must still be there since there was no other way out. However, when she arrived, he was gone. She looked out the window but saw nothing. Convinced it was something supernatural, as she believed in those things, she was quite scared. I, on the other hand, still didn't know what to think. I was trying to find a logical explanation. After all, the last thing I wanted was to feel scared at work. I decided not to tell my colleagues that my patient had also seen the man, because if they knew, they might become even more suggestible, and I didn't want to talk about it anymore. I admit the whole situation was starting to frighten me. When I returned to the floor, I saw one of my patients, an elderly man with Alzheimer's, in the hallway. I rushed to him because it wasn't normal for him to be out of his room at that hour. When I asked what he was doing, he just said, "I don't want to stay here anymore. That man wants to hurt me. I'm leaving." It was difficult to convince him to return to his room. We needed the help of another nurse as he refused, and we couldn't force him as it could hurt him. Despite his Alzheimer's, I knew exactly who he was talking about, and in a way, I believed him. That night was long, and I barely slept, dreaming of the man I had seen. I knew it was some kind of spirit wandering the hospital, but I never saw him during the day. It was at night that patients told me a doctor entered their rooms without saying anything, just watching from the door before leaving. I saw him 2 more times, and the night shift colleagues began joking about it as they had gotten used to the man's presence. One day we mentioned it to a young doctor who got along well with us. He was curious and wanted to know more. The next day he showed up with an old hospital newspaper and showed us a photo, asking if it was the man we had been seeing. To our surprise, it was him. That doctor had worked in the hospital's psychiatric ward in the 1950s and was convicted for conducting experiments on his patients. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison, but committed suicide after only serving 2 months. We were all shocked. The fear only grew knowing he had done so much harm. So what were his intentions when appearing at the hospital at night? I stayed at that hospital for another 2 years before being transferred to another city, and during that time everyone who worked there eventually saw the man. Admitted patients would mention seeing a doctor at night. Although he never did anything tangible, his presence alone was enough to terrify both the patients and the night shift staff. I believe he wasn't the only spirit wandering those corridors. As I mentioned, the hospital is very old, and countless deaths have occurred there, along with other terrible things that happen in such old hospitals. But for some reason, he was the only one who made a point of being seen. I don't know if his intention was to scare or what he wanted, but he managed to give everyone chills. This was my first paranormal experience as a nurse. Thank you for listening. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Hi Dom, my name is Aline and I want to share an experience of mine with you all. This happened during my medical internship, while I was doing shifts of up to 20 hours at the general hospital in my city. That hospital was old and full of stories, many of them involving paranormal phenomena. Additionally, it was there that the bodies of victims of the global event in 2020 were stored. Although I wasn't working at the hospital that year, I started working there the following year. In my first few days, I became friends with 2 colleagues who warned me about strange occurrences in the place, assuring me that I would get used to it over time. I was curious and asked what they meant by that. They shared several stories, both theirs and those of other colleagues, about things that seemed to move on their own in the morgue room and in the building where infected bodies were incinerated. Additionally, on many nights, cries and screams could be heard. At first, I didn't believe it as I was still new to that environment and couldn't imagine something like that happening so frequently. But I adopted the attitude of, I'll believe it when I see it. A few days went by, and one night when I was leaving the hospital on my way to the parking lot, I heard strange noises. I looked around, scared, and even grabbed my pepper spray from my bag. I couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from, but when I looked at the building my colleagues had mentioned, I saw hands banging on one of the small windows at the top. That place was locked and out of operation, always padlocked. I was terrified. I ran to my car, started the engine, and tried to calm down, but my mind kept spinning with what I had just seen. That's when I started giving credit to the stories my colleagues had told me. The next day, when I met my friends, I wasted no time in sharing what had happened. However, they didn't seem surprised. They just said, "We told you, didn't we?" A few days later, I found myself in another equally unsettling situation. I was assigned, along with a colleague, to take the body of a recently deceased elderly man to the morgue. It was early morning, I'm not sure what time, and the morgue was empty of people but full of bodies. The forensic team would only arrive in the morning, so the bodies stayed there throughout the night. The atmosphere in that place was truly heavy, and no one liked going there as the department was in an isolated part of the hospital. Additionally, many sections of that corridor were poorly lit, with flickering lights, which made the environment even more eerie. As we pushed the stretcher down the long corridor leading to the morgue, we were almost there when we heard sounds coming from inside. We could hear the creaking of stretchers, which sent chills down my spine. My colleague, unlike me, seemed more relaxed or perhaps nervous as he was laughing. I don't know if he actually enjoyed that sort of thing or if the laughter was just nervousness. I, on the other hand, was gripped by fear, especially after the experiences I had had on previous nights. "Let's go in, it's nothing," he said. We moved forward, pushing the stretcher into the room where all the others were occupied, with the bodies covered by sheets. The air was dense and the atmosphere unpleasant. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. We placed the body on the stretcher, turned off the lights, and turned to leave. But as soon as we took our first step out of the room, the door slammed shut on its own forcefully. The sound of the creaking stretchers returned, louder this time, and we both ran out. The fear on my colleague's face scared me even more because that door was extremely heavy and definitely didn't close on its own. There was no wind inside, it was impossible. As time went by, the incidents only increased. I remember one particular night when a normally calm patient was out of control. She was screaming, asking for help. I, along with 2 nurses, ran to her room, turned on the light, and saw her face filled with terror. She was lying in bed with her feet dangling off the edge, and she said that someone was in the room with her, trying to pull her by the leg out of the bed. We asked if she had seen who it was, but the answer was frightening. She said it wasn't a person, but something else, which had been in the room the whole time until we came in and turned on the light. We didn't know what to say, but the woman was clearly terrified. She wanted us to call a relative to stay with her, but that wasn't allowed. One of the nurses offered to stay by her side until she fell asleep. However, I had to go take care of other tasks. But that episode stuck in my mind. It was clear from her face that her fear was real. What was most intriguing was that due to her health condition, she couldn't have moved on her own, and we always had to help her get up or adjust herself in bed. The worst, however, was yet to come. One night I left the hospital to get coffee and something to eat at a convenience store a block away. We always passed through a parking lot between the building where I worked and the other one, the one that was deactivated, where I had seen the hands banging on the window. In the early days, walking through there seemed normal until one night I heard screams. But this time the screams were clear. "Get out of here." I panicked and ran back to the hospital, seeking help from 3 colleagues. I really believed that someone was trapped in that building. I told them what happened, and one of them, trying to calm me down, said there was no one there and that I didn't need to worry, as that kind of thing was common. Even so, I couldn't calm down. What I had heard was too clear to ignore. I insisted that they come with me to check the windows and make sure no one was there. They agreed, but they already knew what I would see. We went there, and they turned over a trash can for me to stand on and look inside. With my phone's flashlight, I lit up the inside of the building, and indeed there was nothing there. From that moment on, I avoided going alone to the parking lot because I almost always heard strange noises coming from that place. I feel deep sadness for what happened to all those people during that terrible year. No one should leave this world without a loved one by their side. Every night, I say a prayer for those souls, hoping they are at peace in a better place. Among the hospital staff, most believed that the sounds we heard came from those who lost their lives in 2020. One of the nurses, who had worked there for a long time, said that before that year, these phenomena didn't happen in that building. The hospital had always had a strange aura, being the oldest in the city, but never with the intensity we witnessed after that year. For many, it wasn't surprising to imagine that energies or even souls still wandered there. I panicked and ran back to the hospital, seeking help from 3 colleagues. I really believed that someone was trapped in that building. I told them what happened, and one of them, trying to calm me down, said there was no one there and that I didn't need to worry, as that kind of thing was common. Even so, I couldn't calm down. What I had heard was too clear to ignore. I insisted that they come with me to check the windows and make sure no one was there. They agreed, but they already knew what I would see. We went there, and they turned over a trash can for me to stand on and look inside. With my phone's flashlight, I lit up the inside of the building, and indeed there was nothing there. From that moment on, I avoided going alone to the parking lot because I almost always heard strange noises coming from that place. I feel deep sadness for what happened to all those people during that terrible year. No one should leave this world without a loved one by their side. Every night, I say a prayer for those souls, hoping they are at peace in a better place. Among the hospital staff, most believed that the sounds we heard came from those who lost their lives in 2020. One of the nurses, who had worked there for a long time, said that before that year, these phenomena didn't happen in that building. The hospital had always had a strange aura, being the oldest in the city, but never with the intensity we witnessed after that year. For many, it wasn't surprising to imagine that energies or even souls still wandered there. My name is Bruno, and I had just graduated from nursing when I started working at a public hospital in my city many years ago. I still clearly remember a disturbing experience I had back then, along with my colleagues. It was during the first few months of my career, and I was not yet considered an expert. I was still adjusting to the long shifts, which often extended through the night, and sometimes I wouldn't even leave the hospital until the following day. On one of those nights, I started my shift and was informed about a new patient. She was a 65-year-old woman, admitted by her daughter due to liver problems. She had never accepted treatment before, and her illness was in a very advanced stage. When I went to meet her, I introduced myself as usual, but I immediately noticed something strange. The woman had a menacing look, hard to describe. It was clear that she looked at me with irritation, as if she disliked me from the moment we met. It was something I had never experienced with any other patient. I decided not to pay much attention to her behavior and continued speaking kindly. It's worth mentioning that due to her neglected condition, the woman looked much older than she actually was. Her hair was almost completely white, and I felt sorry when I noticed her long, dirty nails. Whenever I spoke or asked questions, she rarely responded, and when she did, it was in a harsh manner. Because of that, I began avoiding unnecessary conversation, focusing only on doing my job, administering her daily injection and making sure everything was in order, then quickly leaving the room. She had been hospitalized for 3 days, and her daughter had not yet visited. She spent most of her time alone, and despite her hostile attitude, I felt sorry for her. However, one night, while preparing to give her injection, I heard the woman talking to someone in her room. I thought it might be her daughter, which struck me as odd since visitors weren't allowed at that hour, as it was past 11 p.m. When I entered the room, I noticed that there was no one else there. I asked who she had been talking to, but as usual, the response was curt. "That's none of your business." I decided to ignore it and continued with my work, quickly leaving the room. However, a few hours later, while I was in the cafeteria, a colleague came to find me, saying he had heard the patient talking and laughing loudly. When he entered the room, there was no one there either, which made him think she might be hallucinating. I immediately went to her room, and indeed I also heard the woman talking and laughing by herself. When I opened the door, no one was there except her. I asked again who she was talking to, but this time her answer made me uneasy. "Tonight, the youngest patient here is going to die, so go and do your job, leave me alone." I questioned why she would say such a thing, but she just turned her face away, laughing softly as if mocking me. Although I didn't believe her words, something about the way she said it, so confidently and sinisterly, disturbed me. The next night, when I arrived at the hospital, I saw a friend and former university classmate crying at the reception. When I approached to understand what had happened, she told me she had lost her first patient that morning, a baby just a few months old. While deaths are common in a hospital, I couldn't shake the discomfort of the woman's eerie prediction. As a beginner, I couldn't help but think about what she had said. I started avoiding her, especially at night, but it was part of my job and I had to fulfill my duties. Every time I entered her room, the patient would look at me with a cynical, dark smile, as if she knew her words had come true and sensed the fear I was feeling. On many nights, I heard her talking and laughing to herself again. On one of these occasions, I decided to press my ear against the door, trying to catch what she was saying. Very carefully, I moved my ear closer to the door, but strangely, the room fell silent as soon as I did, as if she knew I was there. It was a strange feeling. Before I could move away, something banged violently against the door, startling me deeply. I screamed in fright, and immediately after, the woman started laughing. I angrily opened the door and asked what she had thrown at the door, explaining that it was dangerous and could get me in trouble at work. However, she simply responded that it wasn't her, but rather her friend, who had banged on the door because he knew I was trying to listen. I asked who this friend was, and she replied, "Satan." I left the room still trembling and scared, no longer wanting to care for her as a patient. Luckily, a colleague offered to take over the shift that night, allowing me to avoid seeing her for the rest of the shift. The next night, I was informed that the patient's daughter wanted to talk to me. Unlike her mother, she was very kind and understanding. When I told her about her mother's bizarre behavior, the daughter didn't seem surprised. She said, "I'm sorry for what you've been through. I brought my mother here against her will because she doesn't believe in medicine and practices witchcraft. She makes her own remedies and helps other people too, but her health condition didn't allow her to be left alone, so I brought her here using a bit of a trick." Everything made more sense at that moment, and I felt even more disturbed. I asked to be replaced as her nurse, but the doctor didn't accept. That final night I attended to her was the worst of all. I entered the room to give her injection, avoiding any conversation. However, she surprised me by saying, "Tomorrow I'll be leaving. I just need to deliver one more young soul to Satan." I left the room as quickly as I could while she laughed sinisterly from her bed. Unfortunately, what she said came true. Around 5 a.m., another baby in the incubator passed away. I couldn't hold back my tears and went home overwhelmed by anxiety and fear. That experience deeply shook my life. The next night, I was met with relief by my colleagues. They told me the patient had been discharged because her liver condition was improving and she could continue treatment at home. I was relieved I didn't have to see her again, but still disturbed by the predictions she had made. I don't know who she made a pact with to get better, but the experience left a profound mark on me. Although I didn't abandon the job, it took me months to overcome the trauma.